Okay, and we have the CPI data, which is 9.87%. So that's for the month of December. It has come in at 9.87%. So that is actually much, much better than what the street range was working with, because there was an upper end range of 10.8%. So it has come sub 10%. So there is a huge cool off which has come into vegetable prices this time round. In fact, let's not waste any time and let's get to our guest for a quick comment first on it. Sajid, 9.87% for the CPI data for the month of December. This compares to 11.24% on a month-on-month basis. We're still waiting for the core CPI data.
Quite close to where we were expecting. We were at 9.7% for the month at the lower end of the spectrum. And clearly because of the reasons you've mentioned, I think what you're seeing is a more than 30% correction in vegetable prices around the country, retail prices. And so the only question was how much of that is captured in the CPI for December and how much of that will be captured in January. You're seeing in the first 10 days of January another 20% correction in vegetable prices. So that's the main disinflationary force in the numbers. I think the key is going to be how core CPI evolved, because the RBI had two criteria last month for staying on hold. One was a substantial moderation in the headline rate, which prima facie has been achieved. This is 130 basis point moderation in the headline rate. But the second criteria was whether that core CPI should fall as well. Core inflation should fall, non-food, non-fuel. So it'll be interesting to see how that's printed.
Okay, some more details coming out, and I might be wrong on this, but it seems as though the November CPI data has been revised lower. So, for example, the wires are quoting the December CPI combined inflation rate at 9.87%. This compares to 11.16%. So, in the previous month, they had actually said that it had come in at 11.24%. So, maybe there is a revision in the November CPI data also that came out. But there are a couple of more details coming in where we have the food beverage inflation, which is coming at 12.16% for the month. So that's coming at 12.16%. It's a complete cool off from the 14.72% that we did in the previous month as well. And we have a couple of other details. Fuel light inflation at 6.98%. We have urban inflation, which is at 9.11%. We have rural inflation, which is coming at 10.49%. But the two key factors to watch out for, or the two key points to look at, is 9.87%, which is your headline figure, which is coming as the combined CPI data, versus 11.16% for November, which might actually be a revision lower. We'll wait for confirmation on that. And we have the food beverage inflation, which has cooled off to 12.16%. Indraneel Pan of Kotak also joins in. Indraneel, your thoughts on this?
We were looking at 10.2, but generally the direction is, anyways, we were looking at the vegetable prices being the main influence on the overall headline inflation number. And as you rightly pointed out, with this having been satisfied, I think the next thing that we really need to look forward to is what has happened really to the core inflation, which is the ex-food and ex-fuel inflation. There the RBI was expecting a drop anyways, and these are the two conditions that the governor had clearly said would be essential for him to stay on a pause. So that apart from the headline number, which is cooled off significantly, I would be waiting for that number too.
Okay, Sajid, what are your thoughts on the food beverage inflation, which is coming at 12.16%?
Actually quite similar to what we had thought, because that suggests a moderation of about 2.5% month on month, which is broadly in the range we had picked up, which also then translates, again, this is without looking at all the details, a vegetable price moderation of somewhere around 17-18% in the index in December. So no real surprises on the food front. Remember, this is undoing what happened in the previous month. Food prices went up 2%, almost 2% each of the last 2 months, so this has undone that. I don't think the headline revision of 11.16 versus 11.24 is material. I think the key is going to be where has core CPI printed.
Yep, we're still waiting for the core CPI data. At this point in time, we still don't have those details with us, so we'll wait for the core CPI data. But there will generally be a cool-off according to you, Sajid, in the core CPI data, considering that it's come in sub 10% for CPI as a whole.
I'm not sure we can necessarily say that. In our own forecast, we had a CPI forecast of 9.7. and we still had core being around 8%, which is what it was last month. I think there are multiple forces at play. Clearly, growth momentum is very weak. We saw that in the IP numbers. We've seen that in the weak non-oil, non-gold import numbers. We've seen that in services, with the PMI services being extremely weak. So that should argue for a lower core CPI. At the same time, I keep mentioning that input prices have gone up, margins have been compressed. So it's also understandable why firms may try and normalize margins and keep output prices high. I think these are the multiple cross currents at play. So it's not inconceivable that you have a headline number which is below 10%, but you have a core CPI number which is still at the level it was last month.
Okay. Indraneel, do you think that the RBI would be satisfied with this number? What is the number that you think would be most, which they would be most comfortable with?
I think for the RBI, as I said, one of the conditions that was laid out in the monetary policy statement has been clearly achieved. And as Sajid has also been mentioning, that the core in fact is dropping off very marginally for us also in our projections. And there I think the key issues are also things like, say, a miscellaneous item which as a group would all include education, medical care, entertainment and all these things for which there is no sense that we are getting that it would cool off. In fact, the prices are quite firm over there. So while the overall sort of headline inflation has dropped off, it would be very difficult to sort of understand and analyze what is the implication of this on the core. So we'll have to definitely wait in terms of satisfaction for the RBI from both the numbers rather than just one number.
Okay, Sajid, where does this leave the RBI come Jan 28th? Because we do have industrial production which is now in negative territory for the entire fiscal, despite the fact that it could have been an aberration because of the sugar production issue. But otherwise, with the IIP, which is even besides that absolutely flat, and with the CPI cooling off, where does it leave the RBI on Jan 28th?
Well, if you do see a moderation in core CPI, if core WPI has not accelerated further, then I think it's quite straightforward, because I mean across the board growth momentum is very weak, and the hope has always been that this very weak growth momentum would exert some disinflationary forces on the system. So it gets tricky for the central bank where growth is weak but inflation pressures are rising, and the fact that the headline number has come off so much would mean that it gives the RBI some breathing room. The only challenge is going to be if we find out this evening that core CPI, for example, has accelerated, that the month-on-month momentum is the same as the previous months or higher, and you find a similar direction in the core WPI. That's when it gets tricky for the RBI. If core inflation is moderating, headline inflation is coming off, we know vegetable prices have decelerated again in January, and growth momentum is weak, I think it would be fair to say the RBI would be inclined to stay on hold for Jan. But all of this comes down crucially to core inflation, I must repeat.